We're going to have a second round, and then the hearing will conclude. I want to start, Dr. Curry. When Senator Markey was haranguing you, he said that you had no response to his assertion that 2014 was the hottest year on record. Am I correct that NASA stated that assertion, that 2014 was the hottest year on record, that they had a 38% level of confidence in that, which means that 62%, or substantially more likely than not, 2014 was not the hottest year on record? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, basically 2014 was, according to the NASA and NOAA data sets, in a statistical tie with 2010 and 2005. The UK data set, which has, I think, more credible error bars on their data set, found that it was in the top 10 warmest years. They couldn't fine-tune it any more than that, given the great uncertainties in the reconstruction of global surface temperature data. And I think the uncertainty levels are really too low on all of those estimates, in my opinion.
And indeed, NOAA included 2014, 2010, 2005, 2013, and 1998, 5 different years, as potentially being tied for being the warmest.
Correct.
The last hearing I chaired, when Mr. Mayor, who should have been sitting next to you, testified, he told the subcommittee, quote, "Our planet is cooking and heating up and warming." Does the evidence and data we've been discussing support the assertion that the planet is cooking?
Not cooking, no.
And indeed, another reference was made by Senator Markey to the measurements. Now, I would note, none of the Democratic senators who participated in a press conference earlier today saying, "How dare you ask the data?" Not a single Democratic senator addressed the satellite data. Not a single Democratic senator addressed the fact that for 18 years, there has been no significant warming recorded. Because I suppose it is contrary to their computer model and to their political desire to massively increase government control of the economy and impose trillions of dollars of cost on people who can't afford it. But let's turn to the different measurements, not the satellite data, and if we can put up the next 2 charts. These next 2 charts are from the United States Historical Climate Network. These are the measurements of the thermometers that are measuring climate change. And these in particular record the adjustments that NOAA has done to the climate data. Chart on the left, you can see that between 1900 and 1960, NOAA made relatively few adjustments, and they were relatively minor. And then we see that for the more recent years, they've been adjusting them upwards. And the adjustments consistently are upwards. They're never adjusting downward. Now, the chart on the right likewise looks at the raw numbers are on the top. The raw numbers demonstrate a fair degree of uniformity. But the adjusted numbers, the old temperatures are cooler and the new temperatures are warmer.
Well, there's a number of different groups who do global temperature data sets, and they have different methods for dealing with spatial representativeness, missing data, changes in temperature, measuring instrumentation, adjusting for the time of day, all sorts of different adjustments that they make. And the adjustments, as you can see, are rather huge. Okay, so should we So to me, the error bars should really be much bigger if they're making such a large adjustment. So we really don't know too much about what's going on in terms of, it's a great deal of uncertainty. Yes, I do believe that we've overall been warming, but we've been warming for 200, maybe even 400 years, okay? And that's not caused by humans, okay? There's natural variability involved. And this is exactly what has not been sorted out. Now, the ocean temperature is the current focus of controversy. I mean, the land data sets are sort of starting to agree, but there's a great deal of controversy and uncertainty right now in the treatment of the ocean temperatures. And that has not been sorted out. And so especially looking, in the recent period, if we're trying to sort out what's going on with the hiatus or the pause, we need to look at the satellite data. I mean, this is the best data that we have, and it's global. And we need to sort out the differences between the satellite and the surface observations. And then there's the numerical weather prediction, reanalysis, data assimilation systems that give us a global view. And we haven't been really using that for climate purposes, and I think we need to. So the work is just starting in terms of trying to sort this out.
Now,
and
Dr.
we don't
Curry,
have.
You said something very important there, and that you said the satellite data are the best data we have. Can you explain as a scientist why that's the case?
Well, it's global coverage. It's not a simple measurement. You have to do, a retrieval and weighting functions, and it's a complex problem, but it's reasonably well calibrated and consistent over the last 30-ish years.
And not a single Democratic senator had any response to the satellite data that demonstrates their entire theory of global warming for 18 years hasn't been happening.
Yeah, I mean, we need to sort this out rather than ignore it. I mean, this is what I'm concerned about.
And Mr. Stein, you look like you want to make a comment.
Yeah,
I want to ask a question on this because you also are quite familiar with the cooking of the books of the hockey stick, and indeed, Dr. Curry, you mentioned ClimateGate and the scientists receiving a whole lot of funding to conclude global warming was occurring and then adjusting their results to reflect that. I would note if you systematically adjust the numbers upwards for more recent temperatures, wouldn't that by definition produce a data set that proves your global warming theory is correct? And the more you add, the more warming you can find, and you don't have to actually bother looking at what the thermometer says. You just add whatever number you want.
No, that's what's fascinating about this. Could you just tell me the left-hand date on your chart, Senator? What is it? I can't quite see it from here.
On the left?
On the right-hand chart of the blue and red line. What's the...
In both of them, it's 1900, isn't it?
1900. So you look at the blue line, you look at the red line. This is the adjustment of figures that is going on now. Yeah. What has happened since the global warming pause is that the public does not trust the alarmist establishment to tell them what the climate will be like in the year 2050. What that chart shows is why the public is moving to a new position now where it doesn't even trust these federal agencies to tell them what the climate was like in 1950 or 1920 or 1900. And that's interesting. If these adjustments are merited, if an adjustment in the official recorded observed temperature, because Gavin Schmidt at NASA wasn't standing out by the thermometer in the year 1920, but he suddenly decides a century on, what are we now, 95 years on, that 1920's temperature needs adjusting. That tells you how uncertain the science is. I would also like, Senator, just to say a word about this whole national security thing, because I've never heard anything quite so ridiculous. We are a country in which we have an enemy overseas who so-called radicalizes suburban couples in California who go out and kill people, but we are planning now for global security threats a century hence, because the Maldives might have been swept away by water by then. The entire population of the Maldives are all sunny Muslims Muslim, so they'll fit in perfectly fine if they all move to this Brussels suburb that produced the shooters in Paris. But climate change is irrelevant to the long-term patterns. And I cannot tell you how absurd it is to be talking about climate change as a security threat compared to, say, just to pluck at random, population. In 1920, the British Isles and British West Africa had the same population, about 45 million people, for England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales on the one hand, and what are now Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Gambia, on the other hand. Now, the British Isles has a combined population, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, about 69 million, and British West Africa has a population of 250 million. So the security threat is exactly what we see in Europe at the moment, that Niger, a country that has increased its population by 50% in this century, since the year 2000, and had millions of starving people already that it couldn't feed, and is expected to increase its population tenfold by the end of the century, and all those people are just going to get on a boat and walk into Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal. And the idea that somehow climate change's impact on that is absolutely trivial to the remorselessness of those numbers. And I understand that governments find it easier to deal with cloud cuckoo, fantasy land, saving the planet type issues. But this is a complete waste of time for an already beleaguered Defense Department having difficulty fighting the wars it's actually in right now in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, suddenly dealing with sea levels in the Maldives in the 22nd century. It's completely preposterous and a complete waste of time.
So I'll leave that aside for a moment. and simply observe, if we look to the satellite data, we see for 18 years no significant recorded warming. We see no response from the Democratic senators. If we look to the raw data, according to the raw data in 1940, it appears from this chart, the 5-year mean temperature was higher than it is in recent time. But once you adjust it, if you subtract from the old temperatures and add to the new ones, then you can have measurements that reflect your theory. Dr. Happer, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing about the satellite data, and that is that they are cross-calibrated with weather balloons all over the world. And so it's not simply a couple of groups measuring satellites. There's a quality check that goes on there, and there's no similar thing to the surface data that I know of.
It's a very good point, and indeed, Dr. Christie's chart, as he described, was an average of several measurements of both the satellites and the weather balloon. If we can move to the next two charts, I want to, the final line of questioning I want to address is the effect of censorship, of dogmatism, of intimidation. So both of these come from BarackObama.com, a website I will admit I don't spend a lot of time perusing. On BarackObama.com, the President of the United States is issuing a call out the climate deniers. Too many of our elected officials deny the science of climate change. Along with their polluter allies, they are blocking progress in the fight against climate change. Find the deniers near you. Find the heretics and call them out today. And indeed, they show a number. And I will say, when I first looked at that chart, I was quite disappointed. I thought I was omitted, but then I discovered I am indeed included, along with a number of other elected officials. Indeed, I might note a number of elected officials. What does it do to scientific debate when anyone who dares question political ideology is branded a denier and a heretic? What are the consequences in the academic world when that occurs? Dr. Curry.
There's a chilling effect, okay? People keep their heads down. They look for opportunities just to do something else and to move on, retire. get out of the business. I've talked to any number of scientists who have done this, recent PhD recipients on up to very senior scientists. It has a very chilling effect. As a tenured scientist who's relatively senior, I felt sufficiently secure to speak out. But younger scientists who are not tenured, fear for their jobs. They have mortgage payments, whatever, and, and kids to support. They can't afford to speak out. The social contract currently between the Obama administration and climate scientists is if you say alarming things, you'll get plenty of funding. That seems to be how it's working. And that is very, very pernicious for science.
And do you get funded if you're researching anything other than the orthodoxy of global warming alarmism?
I'm no longer applying for government grants. I can't get funded to do anything I want.
Let me speak more in the aggregate. Does one get funded if one is a scientist and one, I recall being back in high school and studying science, the scientific method, that you started with an hypothesis and then you look to evidence to prove or disprove the hypothesis, and often disproving it is the more useful thing to try to do. Do those who are actually trying to disprove the hypotheses, mind you, the hypotheses that will drive up the electric bills and the cost of living for millions of Americans, will hurt people who are struggling, will hurt single moms, will hurt Hispanics, will hurt African Americans, does anyone doing any research that might contradict the political dogma, are they at all likely to get funding?
Okay, the issue is this: the funding agencies do a call for proposals or an announcement of opportunity, and they're already implicitly assuming that human-caused climate change is dangerous, that there's not even an opportunity or something that even makes sense to write, to submit a proposal to. Right. So that's the real problem. So a lot of the skeptical research is really being conducted by independent scientists who are not asking for any government funding.
Okay, so my final two questions. One of the letters that the minority has submitted into the record is a letter from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A sentence within that letter: we are committed to the principle that scientific inquiry and open scientific communication, regardless of field of study, should proceed unhampered by intrusions on academic freedom. Now, that is a noble-sounding statement and one that with which I agree emphatically. I want to ask the members of the panel, how does that noble sentiment comport with the call from our colleague, Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, that anyone who dares dispute the global warming alarmist orthodoxy should face criminal prosecution under RICO? Are those two statements somehow compatible, that you can have academic freedom and robust debate when you've got politicians saying we will criminally prosecute you as a racketeer if you dispute our political orthodoxy?
Well, that statement by science is the AAAS is really a myth, because about 2 months ago, well, maybe 3 months ago, the editor of Science, Marcia McNutt, had an op-ed in Science that said, the debate is over, urgent action needed, essentially. And this was the editor of Science, which is the flagship journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. When an editor of a scientific journal makes a statement like that, it gives all of the editors a license to completely ignore any publication that submitted that questions a consensus. And this is the real pernicious thing that's going on. So right now, we're more ruled by the RICO mentality than we are by those lofty sentiments expressed by the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Senator, you said your parents were, I think, mathematicians, statistical modelers. We've had a lot of talk today about climate science. I compiled a book that you were kind enough to mention the title of, and what was fascinating me about that book was that climate science evolves. 20 years ago, it was basically a branch of, 30 years ago, physical geography. Now it's basically computer modeling. Yet at the same time, the majority of statisticians who look at the climate models think they are grossly unprofessional. Mathematicians and statisticians who look at the way these climate models and the way the hockey stick were constructed are not on board with it at all. A majority of engineers are not on board with it. A majority of physicists, non-climate physicists, are not on board with this. So this idea that climate science is this hermetically sealed specialty that is sealed off from the rest of the world is nonsense. Climate science, you have dendrochronology types, you have statistical modeling types, and there are elements of all in the work that they do. But certain people, mathematicians, engineers, statisticians, are not on board with this. And Judith mentioned Science magazine. Nature magazine went even further. They're the two most prestigious science journals on the planet, Nature and Science. And Nature printed a statement recently from a group of climate scientists who said, quote, climate justice, unquote, climate justice is more important than democracy. So that the fake 97% consensus is no longer enough. The fake 97% consensus of so-called climate scientists now has to trump the 51% of the electorate. No science in history has conducted itself like this, and it would be unrecognizable to Sir Isaac Newton or Charles Babbage or the Curies to see a self-sustaining, malign politico-science nexus supporting itself and excluding all other voices. It is at odds with scientific inquiry across the centuries.
In 2009, August 31st, 2009, then Senator John Kerry, as I discussed in my opening, said scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013, not in 2050, but 4 years from now. The nice thing about this is, unlike theories that can't necessarily be disproven, this is actually a statement that can be tested by actual facts and evidence. Dr. Happer, was it in fact accurate in the summer of 2013 the Arctic was ice-free?
No, it certainly wasn't ice-free, but if I could follow up on something my colleague just said, actually, this is not unprecedented in climate science. If you look in the Soviet Union for 30 years, it was reigned by Lysenko in biology. And he had complete control over biology. You got fired or worse if you didn't agree with his brand of biology. And that was finally brought to an end, partly because of people from other fields. For example, Andrei Sakharov, the inventor of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, led some of the opposition because he had enough stature to stand up and push back. But most people were afraid. So there was a state of fear that was actually quite a bit worse than climate right now, but nevertheless, it's a good lesson to remember.
And my final question, Dr. Titley, based on your 3 decades serving in the Navy, do you agree with President Obama, who said holding a global warming summit in Europe was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorist who just committed a horrific act of terrorism in Paris and indeed likewise in San Bernardino?
Senator, thanks, sir, for the question. The way I describe these geostrategic risks of climate change, climate is the risk, and it makes the threats such as ISIS, worse. So this is not an either-or. It's not a false dichotomy.
But I'm asking your judgment as a military man if you agree with President Obama that holding a global warming summit was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorists. I find that statement absurd on its face. I'm asking, based on your military judgment, do you agree with the President?
We have to address both, sir. Thank you.
From your declining to answer, I take it the inference of that is that your answer is no.
My answer is, sir, we have to address both the risk of climate change and the threat of ISIS.
Thank you.
Thank you.